This meeting to order. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this 34th meeting of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. As you know, we are meeting today on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Welcome to all of our witnesses and to all of the members of the committee. Also to the members of the public who may be with us today.
Our witnesses who have joined us this afternoon as we continue to study at committee stage Bill C-29. We have with us today Mr. Ellis Ross, member of the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia, who is with us in person, and also Chief Willie Sellers from the Williams...
Monsieur le Président, je m'excuse, Madame...
I'm sorry. There is a point of order by Ms. Gill. I just wanted to make sure that the texts were shared, and I certainly don't want to interrupt the chiefs. Mr. Chairman, I can inform you that the witness, is not here. We have a video conference, so we haven't done a sound test. We have had a chance to do a sound test with you, but we are ready to go. Mr. Ross is here in person, and so we didn't need to do a sound test with Mr. Ross. Can you do the sound test for me and also for Ms. Atwin before we go forward? Of course. Could you tell us about the weather where you are? Today in Montreal, it is cloudy and a bit chilly, and it's fall. Well, we're told, though, that it's going to be nice for the next 3 days, so that's good news. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Atwin.
Weather is sunny here in Fredericton. It's a beautiful day. I just arrived home off the airplane shortly, so hopefully you can hear me good.
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you very much. Dr. Pulowski?
J'irai Thunder Bay.
I'm in Thunder Bay. And can you hear me?
Am I on mute? I'm on. No, you hear me? Good.
Talking, please.
Want me to talk some more? Anyhow, Thunder Bay, the weather won't be so good as Montreal, I'm sure.
Okay, I just got the thumbs up. Yeah, I got the thumbs up from the interpreters. So we're ready to proceed, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
And Madam Clerk, have you checked with Chief Willie Sellers, who is with us online?
He's not with us presently online, and I can't reach him, and I've had my staff try to reach him as well, and he's not responding.
Very good. Therefore, we will proceed with our only witness at the moment, Mr. Ellis Ross, member of the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia. And hopefully Chief Willie Sellers will join us very shortly. As usual, to ensure an orderly meeting, I'd like to outline a few rules to follow. Members or witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services in English, French, and Inuktitut are available. Please be patient with the interpretation. There can be a delay. For those in the video conference, well, at the moment there isn't anybody there, so other than members, so I'll skip that part. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name, and of course, unmute yourself when it's your time to speak and mute yourself afterwards. There is a raise hand feature if you need to bring something to my attention. And when speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you're not speaking, of course, put your mic on mute. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. So with that, the way it works, Mr. Ellis, is you will be invited to make a 5-minute opening remark, after which we will proceed with questions. So if you are ready, Mr. Ellis, welcome, and the microphone is yours for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I was last here 10 years ago to talk exactly the same subject matter but in a different context. I was actually here to actually get the government of Canada to actually support LNG development in BC. And I opened up by saying that I'm not here to ask for money. I'm not here to debate the Indian Act. I'm not here for anything for that, because ultimately what I'm after is my band and the surrounding bands is to be independent. And the only way we could do that was engaging in resource development with LNG, forestry, mining. I'm here to tell you today, the issues that my band was facing 10 years ago are non-existent today because of our engagement. We are one of the few bands that went from one of the poorest nations in BC to one of the wealthiest, including land acquirement. We don't talk about poverty anymore. We don't talk about welfare. We don't talk about unemployment insurance. We don't even talk about the Indian Act. We talk about what's next. We talk about the idea that since we're already fully engaged in the economy and society of BC, what else can we do? And this means independence at the band council level, which doesn't need Ottawa money anymore, doesn't need BC government anymore, right down to the individual, including the single mom, including the guy that just got out of prison and wanted to stay out of prison at the age of 55, a good friend of mine. Unfortunately, the word that we're talking about here today, reconciliation, has been misused for the last 10 years for every single political issue under the sun, while ignoring the dreadful shame that is Canada's, meaning Aboriginals that are stuck in prison, our kids going into government care, the poverty, the violence of poverty, and ultimately suicide. Reconciliation had a definition in the case law that was decided pursuant to Section 35 of the Constitution. It was decided. This was all worked out right up until the Hydro Court case of 2004. Now the word reconciliation has been misused to a point where nobody knows what it means anymore. It's been twisted around. And yet, time after time and example after example, we see the results of what true reconciliation means as dictated by the courts of BC and Canada. It's a shame. It's an absolute shame that it's come to this. So in your deliberations, when you're talking about developing an act to talk about reconciliation, I ask that you look at the issues facing Aboriginals all across Canada in terms of the unemployment rate and look at how it hasn't succeeded, but also look at bands like mine and how they've succeeded and how they're trying to actually make that spread across BC with neighboring First Nation communities, mind you. There is reconciliation happening at the political and economic level between First Nations because not every First Nation has had the advantage that my First Nation has, and it's all based on location. Location. And these are age-old differences that go back way before white contact. And so the message to you today that I would like to talk to you about is basically what not to do. In your deliberations, I wish you talk about the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, something that I opposed when it first came to Canada almost over 10 years ago. And I did oppose it in BC, but voted for it because I didn't want my party to be labeled as racist. But if you follow the lead of BC, you will be doing a disservice not only to First Nations in Canada, but also to the general society, because it was an unrealistic political statement made by the BC government. And they have not lived up to one single promise or commitment that they made in that under what they call DRIPA now. Give you an idea of how unrealistic this is. They promised to consult every band in BC with every single piece of legislation that passed through the legislature. They also promised to align every single law in BC with UNDRIP. That is impossible. It's unrealistic. But they claimed they could do it. Now their answers are that some of the legislation going through there has not been gone to consultation process with the First Nation communities, the true rights and title holders, by the way. Instead, they went and talked to advocacy groups. The other thing they did is they provided notice to First Nations, 203 bands of legislation. That is not consultation, as dictated by the courts. And they also conceded that a number of the legislative and a number of the bills that was passed through the House did not have rights and title infringement questions involved with it, so therefore they did not notify First Nations. That is not what they promised in the legislature. It was a political statement. They have not actually realized one commitment in UNDRIP, and a lot of the DRIPA Act in BC was redundant, and a lot of it was meaningless, meaning every First Nation has the right to save their language. We knew that. Every First Nation has the right to save their culture. We knew that. We didn't need legislation to tell us that. And a lot of the redundancy what I'm talking about is the idea that Canada is a lot further ahead than other nations around the world, including Section 35 of the Constitution. Canada is one of the few countries that recognize rights and title in the Constitution. And yes, it took a long time to define that in the courts. But one of the greatest things that happened was the court case that came down in 2004, the Haida court case, that fully defined the duty of government and also the responsibilities of First Nations to respond in a meaningful manner when the Crown came to consult on infringement issues. It was working. From 2004 to 2017, it was working. The economy was going well with LNG, forestry, and mining, and First Nations, more importantly, were getting involved and getting ahead, and it didn't do anything to society. If anything, it strengthened our society. It strengthened BC. In BC, that has all been pushed aside now for the sake of politics. There are no drilling permits for LNG. They're actually going to shut down forestry at the opposition of First Nations. So
thank you, Mr.
Those are my comments. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. We'll now proceed with the first round of questions. These will be 6-minute rounds. We'll begin with Mr. Zimmer. Mr. Zimmer, you have the microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you. I still want to call you Chief. Chief Ross, who's become a good friend over the years, being a fellow British Columbian. And I'm so glad you brought up reconciliation. This is what we're talking about today in this committee, but in the way that you did, because you talked about examples of how to do it, but how, and also how not to do it. I'll quote an article from of yours in the past, just a couple years ago. Foreign influence is nothing new, but what we are seeing today is a well-executed campaign financed by the likes of Tides Canada and the U.S.-based Rockefeller Foundation. Caught in the middle are First Nations, such as the Wet'suwet'en, whose people are being divided. The other group that's caught in the middle are everyday British Columbians, including fellow Aboriginals who just want to get home, to work, or to the hospital. How does the government support for radical Angos and their agendas help in reconciliation?
It doesn't. And when I got into council, elected as a councillor in 2003 and 2004, my chief councillor had experiences with these types of organizations. And so we spent a lot of time trying to understand the relationship between Angos of this nature and the relationship with the governments of BC and Canada and their agenda, which was all across BC and Canada. It was something we just figured out pretty quick, that the agenda had nothing to do with First Nations interests.
Right.
It had their own agenda that was specific to each organization. And so that partnership or relationship was actually severed between my band and those types of organizations because we were trying to resolve poverty, right, suicides, children going into government care. And so when we finally decided not to welcome them into our territory, especially during the LNG development days, that was when we took a look at BC and Canada and started to see this was happening all across Canada. And we could see other First Nations falling victim to this.
Right. Yeah, and I'm glad you even referred to that because I remember those days. And I guess the question, I'll just say even the definition, we all want reconciliation, I believe. I really do believe that. I think most Canadians do. Oxford calls it reconciliation the restoration of friendly relations. And isn't that something that we all would appreciate, Absolutely. But I've been touring around Northern Canada as a Northern Affairs Minister, and I've spoken with many Indigenous people, Inuit and Nunavut, Wet'suwet'en in Northern BC, and really all across, again, the North. And 80 to 85% of all peoples are supportive of natural resource development, and as a key part of reconciliation, because it's prosperity for peoples. It means everybody's doing well, and we all can do better. And you spoke to it a little bit in the community of the Haisla. I want you to expand a little bit on, again, if this government would decide to really pursue reconciliation where it really makes change on the ground, really helps people in communities like the Haisla. Explain a little bit, again, extrapolate on how good it can be if they were to truly pursue it.
Well, it's not just First Nations success that we're talking about here as well. That matters. I mean, come to my community and see the single mom at self-welfare or my friend that stayed out of prison. But when you talk about resource development at the First Nation stage, you got to remember the revenues and the benefits don't all go to the First Nation. The government gets benefits. And then the government turns around and uses that money for highways, hospitals, schools, even our paychecks as politicians. Everybody benefits from that, non-First Nations and First Nations alike. So the reconciliation we're talking about, I think, should be characterized as a political and a legal relationship that has to be mended, because right now First Nations participate in every part of society that I just mentioned. We love the hospitals, we love our cell phones, we love the highways. It's this political obstruction that we have at the courts that were settled out for the last 10 years that we're now having to go back and revisit. But at the end of the day, true reconciliation at the economic level does benefit everybody. And you're seeing it in action right when we're talking about, our daily lives. Everything that we take for granted is actually what First Nations want. They want to get a mortgage, which is happening right now today. They want to go to the hospital. They want a doctor. They want a nurse. They want a new cell phone. It's this political definition of reconciliation that's holding us back.
How much time do I have, Chair? You're on mute.
You have 1 minute and 20 seconds.
Okay, thank you. And you've made this long trip out to BC, and we've talked about how long it is to get out here, so we really appreciate you being here. I guess in my shortage, last 60 seconds, here's the opportunity. If you were to say, with those 60 seconds and give the government some advice, what would you ask them to do? They're pursuing the legislation, and that's why you're here today. What would be one key thing you want to leave with them?
I'll tell you what I've been saying in BC for the last 5 years. Do not use reconciliation as a tool to divide Canadians. That is not what Aboriginals want. You'll see it. You've seen it when churches were being burned down all across Canada just recently. There were a number of First Nations, including myself, who went out there and said, do not burn down churches. Do not provoke civil disobedience over this. There's a better way to do it, including Aboriginals that went to residential school. There's a small number of people that want to see divisiveness in our country. And it took me a while to realize that actually I'm proud to be from British Columbia, and I'm proud to be Canadian, because I've looked at all across the world at places that don't have it as good as us. We got to remember that. It is a good country, but we can't let politics divide us. So please don't let the word reconciliation further divide the conversation that should be happening, not only here, but all across Canada.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmer. And before we go to the next, just a reminder that what we're discussing in committee today is Bill C-29 specifically. It's a very specific bill and how we can make it better. Members are free to ask their questions if they wish, but it is only what will make Bill C-29 move forward, possibly with amendments, that is of concern to this committee. With that, Mr. Baptiste, you have 6 minutes.
I thank the witness for his testimony, but I'd like to bring things back to C-29. And what we're talking about here is not the political definition of the reconciliation, but the definition and the blueprint for reconciliation decided by the Indian residential school survivors, their descendants, their children, and within that is the 94 calls to action that they've asked our government to implement in the TRC calls to action. Now, what C-29 is meaning to do is to ensure that there is some accountability and independent accountability to ensure that government moves forward on those calls to action. Mr. Ross, I'm wondering if you could tell us, do you believe that we should be listening to the Indian residential school survivors whose feedback went into these 94 calls to action? Do you think that these are worth moving forward on, and do you think that we should be fulfilling the TRC calls to action?
Without a doubt. My parents went to residential school, both of them, but they weren't taken. They were sent by their parents. My mother was sent to actually learn how to look after a household. My dad was sent because his mother had died and there was no one else to look after them. They would not tell me about any of the abuse that they faced. But also, I've actually done this job now for 18 years. And there's a wide spectrum of things that happen to First Nations. It wasn't just residential school. There was the idea that First Nations couldn't even get legal representation. There was this racist attitude that we were no better than animals in the field at the time. There's a lot to make up for. But in today's context, you can't ignore the fact that a lot of our people are still living on the streets. I mean, reconciliation, I don't think benefits that person that went into prison at the age of 16 in Ocala. I don't think he's willing to have that conversation about any type of bill that doesn't speak to how he's living or how he wants to live. I put out a pamphlet when I first heard about the idea that reconciliation was being used for political purposes. And I tried to educate everybody, including my own people, in terms of everything that happened at a general nature, not only in my band, but bands all across Canada, to tell them why we got to do better for today's generation and next generation. So, yes, it's definitely important to talk about residential schools. Truth and reconciliation, yes. But if it doesn't, in my mind, if it doesn't translate to actually making the futures better for Aboriginals and in turn making a stronger country, then I don't see the point.
Okay. Well, Mr. Ross, I appreciate that point of view, and for your parents who went to the Indian residential schools, I'm sorry. My aunt, my uncle also went. As a Mi'kmaq from Eskasoni who's lived in a reserve, there's a lot of things that we need to do better as a government. But that you brought up the justice part, and there are key clauses within the justice that talk about reforming the justice system to making sure that we have less incarceration of Indigenous people, to create alternatives that are all part of the calls to action. Do you believe that it's important to listen to those things that people have told us, the survivors, the intergenerational people who've ended up in prison, and move forward in a fast way and an independent way to ensure that these calls to action are addressed?
Without a doubt, but and I'll be a bit prejudiced here, violent criminal activities that hurt other people, including Aboriginals, can't be put in that light. It can't be. And I'm taking my experience as chief counselor. When we had our public meetings, they asked for more police presence in our community, which we couldn't get, by the way. And yet we were fighting to have more RSMP, especially on weekends. And the activities in my community range from peeping Tom to speeding, but where my community draw the line, when other people got hurt. Mm-hmm. And that included domestic violence. And so I think we really got to be careful here. Mm-hmm. And I don't think violence actually knows no race. When you hurt somebody, especially if it's fatal, I think the laws of Canada and BC have to prevail.
And so I just want to be clear on this, but the 94 calls to action that the survivors and the chairs that put forward in the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, you're in support of our government moving forward to advance these, correct?
Without a doubt, but I would caution that in terms of the case law principles, and there's a lot of them. But what the judge said, there was two things he said. We've got to reconcile these instances because, let's face it, none of us are going anywhere, right? And the other thing he said was government has a duty to address these issues, but government also has a duty to greater society. Yeah. The only thing I'll add to that is greater society now includes Aboriginals because 50% of Aboriginals live off reserve. And so they become a number of the larger population that wants to see a stronger country regardless of any other opinions out there.
And so do you think that it's important also to have an independent committee that has an oversight that keeps the government accountable for the TRC calls to action?
That's really up to the politicians, but it's got to be based on the experiences from other independent committees that might not work so well. And I'm an MLA in BC, and I know the committees that actually, the independent watchdogs that are set up to keep an eye on government, but don't do such a good job. And so if it is going to be set up, the principles have got to be strong, and the lines of authority have to be strong. Otherwise, government will just ignore.
Okay. Mr. Chair, how much time do I have?
You have about 10 seconds, Mr. Baptiste. Very good. Thank you, then. We'll probably have a second round. So, j'irai maintenant à Madame.
I will now go to Ms. Gill for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to thank Mr. Ross for his testimony. In your remarks, you talked about a number of topics, and two terms intrigued me because we are talking about Bill C-29, but you were talking more about background and the political use of the notion of reconciliation, and even saying then that reconciliation wasn't defined in the proper way. Could you explain that a bit further? What definition would you give to reconciliation and its concrete implications? And what would you like to see that concept being used for?
I first heard the word reconciliation when I read the case law, the Haida court case in 2004, when the judgment came down, and it described the government's duty to address infringements of rights and title. And the judge that used it said that we've got to start addressing these because, let's face it, no one's going anywhere, and plus we have a duty to greater society to make this work. Now, originally, I didn't agree with that because I thought the priority for government should address this. But as I learned later on, I couldn't draw a line between First Nations and non-First Nations. I couldn't do it, especially since I enjoyed hospitals, schools, roads, and I have non-First Nations in my family. I have non-First Nations in my community. And there is no way that I'd single them out and say that they're different just because of reconciliation. Over the last 10, 15 years, no matter what the issue is regarding First Nations, I always saw the word reconciliation pop up. And there was a whole spectrum of reasons why they used it. And nobody actually brought the definition of reconciliation back to the case law where it started. There is no start point, in my opinion, to the definition of reconciliation. Everybody's got a different definition. And if there's an objective, a specific objective they want, then it seems convenient to bring out that word. Or it seems convenient to talk about some type of process. But if you don't have a starting point or you don't have a clear definition of what a process is or a word is or what's meant to mean, you're going to have a tough time, trying to achieve your objectives. I mean, we didn't even talk about reconciliation back in our community. All we knew was there's everything that we had in place up to that date, the programs, the government funding, the suicide hotlines, it all failed. Every single one of them. And it wasn't until we walked away from the government funding and all the government programs and all the hotlines and focused entirely on economic development that we realized, yes, inadvertently, we've actually solved all our social issues. I mean, I know you're talking about Bill C-29 in a specific manner, but reconciliation itself, I still believe, if we're not addressing the social ills that plague First Nations, then it's just going to be another committee. And it'll be open to interpretation no matter who's in government to actually use that unless you've got clear objectives.
So it's as if it was a false premise, if I understand you correctly. Another question I have is about the subject we're dealing with today. And what I understand is that on the one hand, the Commission's conclusions are somewhat erroneous. The calls to action are not properly based. And so when it comes to the Council, is something that you would feel is not relevant. So I'm trying to understand what your position is about the Commission and about the Council that we're dealing with in this legislation today.
So I don't actually know the details of what you're talking about. I do know you're talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission findings and whatnot. And when that first came out, I was part of the Chief and Counsel Highs Law. And I didn't read that fully. Because to me, the issues that I just talked about, I lived them. I live in reserve. I still live in reserve today. And when you're talking about violence, alcoholism, drug abuse, unemployment, poverty, and you live it, and you want to change it, then these reports don't mean much. I don't know anybody in my circle that read that report. In fact, I think today I'm still the only First Nation member of my community that read the Indian Act. Didn't understand it. I think I'm still one of 2 people that read as much case law principles and trying to define rights and title, because I was just trying to find a way to address social ills. And this is part of the frustration I have in terms of these kind of talks going all across Canada. Nobody talks about what we're trying to achieve. It just seems like a high-level discussion on how to make us feel good about something, when really First Nations are still committing suicide. They're getting hooked on fentanyl, crystal meth. They're on the streets. There is no real authority to address all the people are living off reserve in our urban centers. And now, with the ability that my band has and their own choice, they say that anybody's on our band list, no matter where they live in the world, we're going to help them. We're going to help them with drug addiction issues. We're going to help them with bus passes. We're going to help them with recreation. We're going to help them with travel. And guess what? Ottawa can't say anything about it because this is all our own money. It's not mandated by Indian Act funding agreements.
Thank you. Merci, Madame Gill.
Thank you, Ms. Gill.
Now go to Ms. Idlaut for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I am hearing something that something very different from what I have heard before. My fellow Indigenous people have been advised that we were forced to speak English and not allowed to use our own language. And now there have been certain people appointed, certain committees appointed to try and work out these issues. And first, I want to ask you, in regards to Bill C-29, how do you understand it?
To either define or actually implement reconciliation measures for Canada. That's what I was invited to talk about.
Okay.
My opinion on the word reconciliation.
Okay.
I will now read to you 7D of Bill C-29, which states the monitor policies and programs of the Government of Canada and federal laws that affect Indigenous peoples. What is your opinion on that?
That is quite the task, because at the minimum, there's 5 different funding agreements that First Nations could participate, and they're based on financial competency. We've got a long way to go before First Nations can become independent. But to monitor it, to be frank, when I got on this political role to take my people out of poverty, I actually segregated Indian Act funding in my community. I took all the Indian Act programs and I got rid of most of them. And I made it a staff issue. And I actually...
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you there for a moment. I am sorry, but I want to stop you right there. I want to ask you another question.
Ross, the interpreter is saying that Ms. Idlaut would like to ask you another question.
Okay, go ahead.
I am sorry to stop you in your midst of your answer, but we have very little time. I want to ask you, in your reserve, how many use their own language and how many practice their customs and traditions? Do you have any numbers to validate the programs or anything of this kind?
But our band council, with its own revenues now, is starting up to fund cultural groups and dance groups and language groups. But the problem is our people have no interest in learning our language. The culture that was actually slowly being weakened over the last 50 years is slowly starting to go away now. There's a push to reinvigorate the cultural side of things and the customs and the language, but I think it's got to be in the context of the 21st century, because a lot of people are just trying to put food on the table. I actually promoted my own vision of how to do this, to actually gain interest, because every language and culture program we started under culture took about 2 weeks before everybody dropped out. But I think we need a different approach.
How much time do I have left?
You have about a minute and a half, Ms. Sidlout.
Thank you. I think it is obvious that culture and languages have been lost. Doesn't this call for reconciliation? Is to revive the languages and cultural practices and traditions? Shouldn't there be more research done to see how much of the traditional languages and cultures have been lost due to residential schools and such? Shouldn't there be something in place to monitor and to see what is needed to revive culture and language?
Yes, there should be something in place, but to be frank, there's always been something in place to monitor culture and language. I think what's missing is incentive. I mean, you think about a 22-year-old single mom. She's got enough on her plate. She can't go to language classes. So the proposal I put was complete with incentives. I mean, everybody's got the right to save their language. It doesn't matter if you're Italian, Russian, shouldn't have said Russian, but First Nations, everybody's got that right. But who's got the energy and the incentive to learn it? I mean, there's a lot of people in my community that want to teach the language, but nobody shows up to class. I think we're missing incentive. So I've actually dealt with that language and culture issue for the last 18 years. And my proposal was close to getting approved before I stepped down as chief counselor and ran as MLA. But I still believe we're missing incentive. Make it fun. Make it enjoyable. Make it lucrative.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ross. We will have a shortened second round, and we'll begin with Mr. Schmale, I believe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ross, for appearing. It's always a pleasure listening to you speak. I want to talk a bit about what you were talking about, economic reconciliation. In this context, I want to talk about the structure of this committee. So the transitional board under C-29 is appointed by the minister. Now, this transitional board gets to decide what the subsequent next committee is, how it's formed, right? And the next committee that's formed then sets the structure going forward for decades and years to come. Right now, there is no plan in the immediate future to put groups like the Native Women's Association or anyone even talking about economic reconciliation at that original table to set forward the plan going forward. Harold Calla, which I'm sure you know, who I know, yes, you know quite well, was in the committee just a few days ago, said we need someone at the table who wants to talk about economic reconciliation. Would you agree with Harold Calla's comments?
Yes, I would. And Clarence Louie out of the Okanagan. There's a number of Aboriginal leaders who feel strongly that economic reconciliation not only lifts up First Nations, but actually lifts up the provinces in the country. And the proof is out there. In my community, for example, the economic reconciliation that we actually participated in not only made us one of the wealthiest bands in BC, but for some reason got rid of the alcohol parties. I think a study should be made in that respect. Where did all the house parties go? Because when I grew up, every weekend I knew of 5 or 6 houses you could travel from house to house to house in one night. It's all gone. And instead, what we have are young Aboriginals getting mortgages in their own right without depending on Indian Affairs or their bank council. They're going on vacation. They're planning the futures for their children. I mean, reconciliation, in my mind, in what I've experienced in the last 18 years, is a buzzword. Without concrete results of seeing somebody get off the welfare list or get away from the ideas of committing suicide or their children not going into government care. I mean, I keep coming back to the idea that a phrase I heard a long time ago, this is Canada's shame. How do we fix it? Well, government, you can't. If you could fix it, it would have been fixed long ago. If you're going to do something in partnership with First Nations that can make their band councils independent, and more importantly, their band members. If you want an example, come to my village, Kitimat Village, BC. I'll show you around.
I would love to see that, actually. Speaking of the economic reconciliation piece, I believe it was in January, some criminals trespassed and did some pretty severe damage to the Coastal GasLink construction site. Major damage to vehicles, to buildings, putting that project at risk. What does that do to those Indigenous people who want to see that project succeed and see opportunity and create wealth and take opportunities like you just mentioned, vacations, and start planning for the future for their children?
Well, it discourages First Nations, especially the band members who don't want to take sides in that kind of an argument. There was First Nations on that job site that night, and they were scared. People were running around with axes and fireworks and firing them and flares and firing at them. But it's not the first time this has happened. In the early LNG development days, the workers, the Aboriginal workers that signed on to do the preliminary work for LNG development, they had their cars keyed, their tires flattened. Even myself, even today, I'm called an apple. You know what that means? That means red skin on the outside, right? But white on the inside. I'm not even red on the outside. But I get called a sellout. I get called all kinds of things. But I think the objective is clear. If we want Aboriginals to get away from the violence of poverty, then we've got to think about doing something different. And right now, there's a lot of silent majority First Nations that agree with what I'm saying and doing. Case in point, every First Nation from Prince George to Kitimat, and 22 First Nations signed on to LNG. They signed on to forestry agreements, mining agreements. And they're doing it with the highest environmental standards in mind, but also to get their people away from the Indian Act and away from poverty.
So if this structure of this committee is not done properly, C-29 as written, if we don't have someone at the table with economic reconciliation on the forefront, this could potentially slow down that piece of this whole puzzle, the reconciliation puzzle, and the ability for First Nations communities to chart their own course.
Mr. Ross, you have 10 seconds to answer.
Without a doubt, because that's what we're seeing in BC right now with UNDRIP. We're seeing it. Everything's slowed down, including LNG. 18 LNG projects. We're now down to 1 major project and 3 minors. So we're seeing.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Mr. Weiler for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I also want to thank Mr. Ross for making the trip out here to Ottawa and for the unique perspective that you're bringing today. You mentioned earlier in your testimony the concerns about making reconciliation political, and I think it's something we all need to be very conscious of. And the idea behind this body that's being contemplated here is that it'll be independent and it'll be able to report back on progress against or on achieving the truth and reconciliation calls to action, and have an action plan that the government will have to respond to each year to be able to demonstrate progress. So I was hoping you could give your opinion on the value of such reporting back function.
Hugely important, especially when we're talking about transparency and accountability. But what are the benchmarks? Will you be looking at unemployment levels, suicide levels, children in government care, people in prison? What will you be measuring? I mean, if it's a measurement of programs and government programs, we've been dealing with that for the last 1,500 years. It didn't help us. So that's why I really encourage, and this is all based on experience. I lived the Indian Act experience, I lived the poverty life, and now I'm living a different life. My kids are living a different life. My grandkids have a future that I never could have imagined. So I do appreciate the reporting that you're talking about this, but I go back to it, that if you don't have hard objectives written into this, hard terms of reference, the reporting will not benefit First Nations on the ground. So that leaves the question, who's it going to benefit?
Well, I think that's a good point, and maybe to follow up on that, the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, the 94 of them, are not just responsibilities of the federal government, the responsibilities of other orders of government, other organizations across Canada. And of course, you bring a unique perspective being a sitting MLA in the provincial government. What role would you see the provincial government in reporting to this body so that not just the federal government, but also provincial government is held accountable to progress on reconciliation?
That's a really good question, because for the most part, within the borders of a province, the province has full responsibility to address rights and title infringements. And there is an economic component that goes into addressing that. If a project crosses boundaries or gets into the ocean, then the federal government steps in. That's partly why I'm here. I want to know, what can the federal government do in terms of easing the regulatory process for some of the projects we're talking about, specifically LNG. So the reporting that you're talking about that's going to come from the province, I strongly urge that you ask for a report on how the negotiations are happening on the ground in terms of that Crown First Nation relationship in relation to rights and title infringements, including the economic component.
Absolutely. And the earlier you mentioned some concerns about some of the government watchdogs and their operations and their track records in British Columbia. And as we're setting up this particular, or contemplating setting up this particular body, what advice would you have for us to ensure that this body will be accountable and effective at reaching its intended outcomes?
Well, I've been doing this job for about 5 years now, and the one thing that I really encourage for myself is to be strong and ask the tough questions and say, what people don't like to hear. What I talk about is not popular. I know I've got a target on my back for what I say because I'm not politically correct. I go straight to the point. So if you're going to do this, yes, you do need strong language, but you also need a strong champion to call out the lack of transparency and accountability or lack of reporting thereof.
And I think one of the things that distinguishes our province from other provinces in the country is that we have a very, very wide variety of governance systems within Indigenous communities. And so when we're thinking about the membership of this board, I'm wondering if you have advice on how we make sure we bring those different voices to bear so that it'll be truly reflective of the diversity of Indigenous experiences and governments across the country.
So we're experiencing this in BC right now. And right now the question of leadership, political leadership versus legal leadership. And it's a question that I said that federal government and provincial government should stay out of. But they should support some type of initiative and process for every First Nation to figure this out. Right now, it's dividing many of our communities in BC, including the Wet'suwet'en, and it's not serving anybody, especially when their elected leadership actually supported some of the projects that their hereditary leadership is opposing. And at the end of the day, it's the band members that are actually feeling the brunt of what's going on out there, the negative of it. So I suggest that the BC and the provincial and federal governments actually create a process, but don't get involved beyond that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Weiler. We'll now go to Madame Gill pour 2 minutes et demie.
2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very quickly then, Mr. Ross, if I understand correctly, you talked about UNDRIP and said, for example, that it was perhaps not the solution and that you didn't necessarily agree with the calls to action that the government would like to implement. So I imagine that you don't really have any recommendations for the committee on Bill C-29, any amendments, for example. You can say yes or no.
I didn't say I didn't agree with Truth and Reconciliation. I said I didn't really read it. Because we had a process in place already that was actually working. I read case law principles because I knew that really ultimately, if I was going to move forward, I had to have a relationship with the provincial government. And that the case law actually dictated the principles on how we were supposed to operate.
À ce moment-ci, je vais vous arrêter, Monsieur Ross.
I'm just going to have to stop you there because it's a bit difficult for me to see how we here in the committee can amend the bill if we don't, if you don't think that the council would do a good job. I just have 1 minute left. But you said that there are a lot of things that bother you. I think that we can agree that we are here as a committee to work on those. And so perhaps you could give me some examples of your position and what you would suggest be done. Thank you.
Economic reconciliation has got to be a big part of what we're talking about here in terms of the word reconciliation. But there's other pieces. The funding agreements, very paternalistic. The politics of what First Nation can do and can't do. In BC, members of the sitting government, they actually stated that First Nations should not be looking to LNG as part of their future. They should look to examples of what they did in the Okanagan in terms of real estate development. That's a mentality that's in BC. And yet you have examples of First Nations advocating and supporting energy projects, forestry projects, mining projects. And I'll keep going back to it. I came from a life of poverty. I'm now witnessing the opposite. I'm witnessing a band council that doesn't need Ottawa money, that doesn't regard the Indian Act in any way. And more importantly, I'm seeing the band members succeed. To me, that is the result of good reconciliation because it benefits everybody in BC, not just my band members.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll now go to Madame Idlout for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Now, we all need to know our identity and our culture and our language. You know, when that culture and the language was trying to get beaten out of us, it was not good. But now, as Indigenous peoples, we had existing laws amongst our own people, and towards reconciliation, I think we should also acknowledge that there were existing laws, and as it is now, you are talking about laws that were brought by white people. Have you ever studied any Indigenous laws?
Yes, I have. But they didn't relate to what we're going through today. And language and culture are important, but you can't force it on people. Everything that we tried to actually revive our language and culture in Kitimat Village failed.
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you right there. Should we not be moving towards reconciliation? And shouldn't we be using existing Indigenous laws of our cultures to move towards reconciliation?
So the laws of my community, I don't know what your community is like, but the laws of my community didn't relate to what we're experiencing today. In fact, I talked to elders of my community about that issue, and they said they couldn't help me because I was dealing with corporations, I was dealing with government, I was dealing with other First Nations. And by the way, those other First Nations we had a long historic record of warring with each other. We didn't like each other. And so a lot of the laws that I was told didn't relate to what I was actually trying to achieve.
You have not yet answered my question. Don't you believe that laws of that already existed amongst Indigenous people, shouldn't they also be acknowledged and used as a means towards reconciliation?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, every culture, every society around the world has some form of process or custom related to reconciliation. But none of it really related to what I was doing, because really what I was trying to do was trying to find a solution for the poverty. But we did have a reconciliation process for other First Nations in our region, but that was really involving allowing them to come into our community and take advantage of the economics that were in play then. But the laws that I don't know what your community's like, but my community did not have laws that related to what I was doing.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. I'd like to thank Mr. Ross for coming all the way out to Ottawa to answer the committee's questions today. Very much appreciated getting your insights on this very complex issue. Thank you once again for coming. And with that, we'll suspend briefly while we check the microphones for the two next panelists. Thank you. Thank you for your forbearance as we deal with these problems. I'd like to welcome Ambassador Clément Chartier from the Manitoba Métis Federation. This is in the context of this committee, the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee, studying Bill C-29 at committee stage. The way we do things, Ambassador, is that we will ask you to make some opening remarks for up to 5 minutes, and then the committee members will have an opportunity to ask you questions. With that, if you're ready, please, the microphone is yours for 5 minutes of introduction.
Thank you, Honorable Chair, members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here representing the MMF, the national government of the Red River Métis. I appear as the ambassador responsible for internation and international relations, appointed as such by President Chartrand and the MMF cabinet. On previous occasions, I have appeared as president of the Métis National Council, which we once belonged to, and a position I held from October 2003 till the end of September last year, 2021. The Manitoba Métis Federation formally withdrew its membership in the MNC organization on September 29th, 2021. On July 6, 2021, the Manitoba Métis Federation executed the Manitoba Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Agreement with Canada, copies of which I believe you have. By this agreement, the MMF inherent right to self-government is recognized and affirmed, the only Métis Nation government recognized as such by the federal government since President Louis Riel brought the Métis Nation into confederation through the Manitoba Act 1870. The agreement clearly states that the MMF represents the Red River Métis wherever they may live, whether inside or outside of Manitoba, and for that matter, whether inside or outside of Canada. In this connection, Red River Métis is synonymous with the historic Métis Nation and its citizens. The MMF General Assembly in 2014 adopted a resolution which opened its citizenship application process to Red River Métis living outside of the geographic borders of the province of Manitoba. At its General Assembly held this past weekend, the MMF adopted a resolution declaring the MMF is the national government of the Red River Métis. Between June and September of this year, a Beyond Borders task force, of which I was the lead, visited 14 cities within the homeland in Western Canada and the northern United States, as well as cities outside the homeland in British Columbia and the cities of Ottawa and Toronto, which are located or locations where numbers of our citizens have relocated to for employment and other purposes, but are still registered citizens of the national government of the Red River Métis. My government is prepared to support C-29, even though there is still unfinished business in connection with reconciliation and the Métis Nation experience in day schools and residential schools, and in particular, the Île-à-la-Crosse Residential School, which I attended for 10 years, followed by a year and a half at the Charlebois residence in Lapointe, Manitoba. My government is pleased with the legislation enacted by the federal government over the past several years. This includes the legislation creating the two departments which have replaced the Department of Indian Affairs, as well as legislation aimed at the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In particular, both the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Act and the Department of Indigenous Services Act in their definition section state that, quote, Indigenous governing bodies means a council, government, or other entity that is authorized to act on behalf of its Indigenous group, community, people, or people that holds recognized Section 35 rights, which are recognized and affirmed by the Constitution Act 1982. In their respective preambles, both state the Government of Canada is committed to achieving reconciliation with the Métis through renewed nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationships based on affirmation and implementation of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. The United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act 2021 in the preamble refers to the Métis Nation and other Indigenous peoples which throughout their history lived in the lands that are now Canada with their distinct identities, cultures, and ways of life, and that Canada rejects all forms of colonialism. We remain concerned, however, that the federal government has not kept pace with the reconciliation process, in particular, the nation-to-nation, government-to-government, and reconstituting of Indigenous nations initiatives, in our case, the Métis Nation. With the establishment of the Section 35 Rights Reconciliation Tables for Indigenous Peoples in 2016, the federal government, in relation to the Métis Nation, chose only to have 4 tables with the then governing members of the Métis National Council and refused to establish one with the Métis National Council, the then national body representing the Métis Nation. And I underscore the then body representing the Métis Nation. This has led to the further consolidation of the colonial boundaries established in 1905 with the creation of the provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta and the dismemberment of the historic Métis Nation homeland in Western Canada. Nevertheless, today we are moving toward one nation, one people, which accords with the federal government's reconstituting Indigenous Nations initiative, in our case, the historic Métis Nation. In this connection, we are opposed to and will oppose any federal legislation which attempts to further divide or dismember our homeland, and in particular, legislation which purports to give provincial Métis organizations self-government recognition under Section 35. Not only are we, the Red River Métis, facing threats from within, we are also facing threats from without our nation, from outside of our nation, with hundreds of thousands of individuals of mixed ancestry in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritime provinces claiming to be Métis and perpetrating cultural and identity theft. In order to prevent further injustice to the Métis Nation, the MMF, the national government of the Red River Métis, must be included in the proposed council unless the act is meant to deal only with Indigenous organizations and not governments. This, however, cannot be the intent, as it would exclude the sole and legitimate government, the sole and legitimate representative of the historic Métis Nation, the Red River Métis, and its national government. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll now go to the first questions. I believe it's Mr. Vidal for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ambassador, for being here today and sharing your knowledge with us. We do appreciate that. In your comments, you said you would support Bill C-29, and my first or a two-part question. One is that in the sense of the way it is, or are you looking for any changes or amendments that we might talk about in the next few minutes? And secondly, maybe you can include in there that the Manitoba Métis Federation President, Mr. Chartrand, back in June of 2022, made some comments that I would interpret as not supporting this legislation when he said, I think Canada needs to catch up with their agreements that they've signed and commitments they've made. I'm looking forward to a call or a letter with Minister Miller, whoever's going to be the lead on this, to advise the Red River Métis of our involvement. So you're saying you support it, but the President didn't seem to be supporting it back in the end of June. So was there a call? Was there some interaction that has changed your Federation's position on this piece of legislation?
I may have misspoke. I think I said is prepared. But there are certain things that need to be met before that happens. And in particular, as I've stated, okay, first of all, then we don't support it the way it is.
Sorry, will or won't?
Will not.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just wanted that clarity. Thank you.
There needs to be changes.
Okay.
And depending on what the changes are, we may or may not support it. Or we may support it if it's meant for Indigenous organizations, which we're not. We are a government. And so if this nonprofit corporation, and we didn't even study to see if we want a nonprofit corporation or what it is that we want. In fact, our preference as a government is that we would be engaging this on a government-to-government, basis with governmental, with more powers for Indigenous governments. But again, maybe you need a separate one with governments and one with nonprofit corporations. And within the Métis National Council now, you have 4 organizations, non-governmental organizations, making it up. They are not governments. They hope to be, and we hope they don't, because we don't want to be divided along provincial boundaries.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to be rude, but I've got such limited time, and I want to drill a little more into a couple of things. Thank you. Yep. The way the legislation is currently written, it's supposed to gather data from all levels of government, not just Indigenous. So it's all levels of government: federal, provincial, Indigenous governments, and all organizations. So one of the challenges that we're concerned with on this is there's a lack of independence potentially in how this thing is being structured, where the minister has an awful lot of control in appointing the first board of directors, and then that board of directors will create the process for which future board members will be elected by a membership that yet's undefined. So I guess a couple questions in there. Would you agree or disagree that there should be a broader scope of people that definitely have a seat at this board of directors? And would you have an opinion at all on who should be the members of this nonprofit corporation? Because that's a yet undefined term as far as we can find.
My government and myself personally, but I'm not here to represent myself, but my government is unlike any other government, or even if you wanted to call us organization, would be unlike any other organization. Because, and I've said this ad nauseum, but I'll say it again here today, the Métis, our residential schools, were not covered by the apology. Mm-hmm. We're not part of the mandate of the TRC. We don't believe we're covered by the recommendations because they had no mandate, and we may fall into it, by happenstance, but it's none of ours. In fact, I haven't even read them, and I was president at the time, and when it was released, I was 2 blocks away from my apartment watching it live at the Delta to an event I wasn't even invited to. So it has nothing to do with us, really, and I think that's one of the points President Chartrand was making. We can deal with you, being the government, particularly the federal government, on a bilateral basis, on a government-to-government basis, to address the issues that remain outstanding. In addition to, and you know very well, La Crosse in your riding.
Absolutely.
And I did try to get meetings with you. I was in your riding, but they never happened. So I moved out. I moved to Saskatoon. But in any event, that's an outstanding issue. The 60 scoop for Métis is outstanding. The day schools are outstanding. The child welfare situations are there's a lot of stuff outstanding. And now that we have a government-to-government relationship, now that the federal government has an agreement with us, that we are a recognized government, and are in the process of concluding a treaty, which will get force of law through legislation will be protected under Section 35. We're not sure that, and I won't pretend to be able to say to your answers, should there be more and who should they be, because it really has nothing to do with us. And when I say we could support it for those that it's aimed for, and we're outside of it. So it really, in that sense, doesn't matter whether we support or don't support it.
So you don't
Thank
want
you, Mr. Vidal. It's your time is up. It's now over to Mr. McLeod for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witness for appearing today. I think him and I are probably the only two residential school survivors in the room right now, and it's really good to hear his point of view. As an Indigenous person, as a Métis, I was quite excited to see that this board set up, structured and set up, and moving forward. There's many things that are happening under the label of reconciliation, and UNDRIP is one of them. The Truth and Reconciliation recommendations, some of the changes to self-government policies. So there's many things we can point to that are happening and quite exciting in the world of Indigenous people. And I think most people would agree, most Indigenous governments would agree that there has to be oversight, because most Indigenous governments don't trust governments, and it's important to be able to make sure that we're still moving forward to reach the goals that we've set up. Now, when it comes to the composition and the work of the National Council for Reconciliation, I think there's some important seats that need to be held by people that went to the residential schools, not people that went to the federal day schools. I think they need to be really included and involved. And right now, I see, many national organizations really pushing for more seats. And I just wanted to get your opinion to see what you think about having seats set aside for people that are, residential school survivors, federal day school survivors, or maybe even traditional knowledge holders, people from your organization, from your government that carry a lot of knowledge and could take it forward.
Well, I'll have to confess that I haven't studied. I was asked on late Monday to appear on behalf of President Chartrand. And in fact, after I wrote my brief, I did find the news articles that were referred to and the comments that he made, because I don't have a staff yet that can do that for me. But I do agree that it should be weighted more towards survivors, who are the ones that have suffered, the brunt of the residential schools. I do agree, though, that national Indigenous organizations, if they truly represent who they say they do, have a right to be there. So I would have no qualms with the Inuit Tapirat Kanatami and the Assembly of First Nations being there representing, their people, and I'm sure they would do the right things in, appointing people that have been affected, by the residential schools system. I think their wisdom would go in that way. And for others, I know there's to be others to be selected, and I think those others should come, specifically from, use the term survivors. I don't really embrace that term, but for those that went through the experience, should be there for sure. So.
Yeah, my second question is around the goals of the National Council. The stated goal of the National Council is to advance the efforts of reconciliation with Indigenous people, which is a very broad goal. And it's going to be done through efforts like developing a national action plan. It'll mean conducting research. It'll mean educating the public. And so I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what are some of the areas, some of the issues that you'd like to see the National Council focus on?
Therein lies the problem as well. You see, our government, and I think this is what President Chartrand was getting towards, is we don't need any intermediary between the national government of the Red River Métis and the federal government or any other government. We should be dealing on a bilateral basis, on all of these issues on ourselves. And if there is going to be, and I imagine there will be a body such as this, then fine. But it shouldn't be a replacement of legitimate Indigenous governments dealing with other governments. I mean, there are three orders of government in this country: Indigenous governments, the federal government, and provincial governments, and under them, municipal governments. So we need to ensure that, by creating this, it's not diminishing, the role and authority of legitimate Indigenous governments. And I'm glad you raised the mandate, because I read it, and I had to go to finally read one or two of the recommendations. Like I said, I've never read the calls to action, but I read those ones that were mentioned. And it does talk kind of in broad terms, but my sense is still that it's going to be more of the mandate will be looking at implementations of the calls to action rather than something broader. And I know in previous discussions with then Minister Bennett, she's saying, no, it's not just the calls for action. It's going to be, across the board on everything. But it doesn't really say that in the bill as well. And I suppose if it did, then we'd question more, why is a nonprofit corporation being put in a position where it's going to be usurping, potentially the role of legitimate Indigenous governments.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod. We will now go to Ms. Gill for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chartier, for your testimony here today. I will just wait for a moment because Mr. Chartier will find it easier to understand what I have to say if he can listen to the interpretation. Thank you. I will just pause the time and make sure that we're ready. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And once again, thank you, Mr. Chartier, for your remarks. I found it very interesting because you've brought up an idea we haven't necessarily heard before in the committee, and that was the calls to action. I'm going to ask you a question about that. You said that you hadn't read the calls to action. Could you tell us why you haven't done so before, perhaps for personal reasons or because of your work and the position taken there?
Well, primarily, and I did state this, but I'll state it again, it's because we were not included. The Métis Nation was not included. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2006, 2007, dealt only with residential schools that were paid for by the federal government. I was on the floor of the House of Commons as leader of the Métis Nation when Prime Minister made the apology. And basically, I was there because at the end of the day, there are some 200 Métis that went to these residential schools. And I was saying, there are 200 fortunate Métis because they got something out of it. Unfortunate didn't have to go, but fortunate that they were covered by the apology and some compensation. But we weren't. And we raised it. I raised it on the floor, and we've been raising it since. But nothing is being done by the federal government. It's like we don't care. They don't matter. I see these orange shirts. They say every child matters. And I'd like to go there and say, except if you're Métis. But I can't do that to every orange shirt that I see out there. And no government, conservative government or the liberal government, is doing anything about it. And the reason is saying because the Catholic Church, just church run. They weren't funding the church to run, the residential schools for Métis. And so we were excluded from the TRC mandate. And I did attend 2 or 3 of them as an invited guest to go make this message that we're still there. And we pleaded with the commission to put in a specific resolution that the Isla Cross School be dealt with. they did put in a weak resolution along the way that all the rest should be dealt with. But we weren't addressed, and we're still not addressed. And so I didn't read it for that purpose, because what for? And even this body that's being set up, as I say, really isn't for us. You know, it's for others. And I hope it goes ahead, you know, for the benefit of others. And but really, it's hard for us to embrace it because we're excluded. Similar to the province of Quebec when they were left out in September of 1981 from Canada's Constitution. I mean, people that are excluded don't really feel like participating, you know, to the greatest degree, you know, possible, and that we should continue working the way we have. And the Métis Nation has made substantial strides, don't take me wrong, substantial strides, particularly over the life of this past government. And for example, during 4 federal budgets, we got over $3 billion. First time in our history we're included in the federal budget. And government is trying to do other things. One of the things that government has also done, which you should keep your eye open for, is they've amended the Indian Act. They amended it, less than a year ago or so. But that's just thrown open the doors wide open. All of a sudden, I have half of my nieces and nephews at home are applying for Indian status. My brothers and sisters aren't, but there's some, you know, because it was so wide open, we have no connection to the Indian community, but yet it's thrown wide open. So doing a disservice to the Métis Nation and its citizens, doing disservice to the, you know, the Indian community, that having all these people coming there. And it's the same as across a lot of Canada, where people of mixed ancestry are coming forward and saying, oh, we're Métis now because we found some great ancestor, you know, some ways back, you know, in the generations. So
Je m'excuse, je ne voudrais pas vous interrompre.
I don't want to interrupt you, Mr. Chartier. I would listen to you for a lot longer time. But I have 2 other questions. Perhaps you could send us additional information in writing to the committee, because we would be pleased to read more. I would like to know, well, could I say that in your opinion, and on behalf of the government that you represent, that the calls to action are not legitimate? And as a follow-up to that, would you like to be included, for example, in the council? You said that you weren't consulted and that you aren't represented by the calls to action. So would you like to be part of the council? And my third question, and you could perhaps answer in writing, and perhaps you touched on this earlier, and that is, what would you propose for the Métis Nation of the Red River?
Yes, very big question. Essentially, I firmly believe that those Indigenous peoples that suffer the Indian residential school and are covered by the apology, the mandate, and the calls for action, I think something more should be done. And if that's the vehicle that they choose to participate with, fine, you know, either in this stage or in a strengthened one. That's up to them. Again, we wouldn't want to say we want to be on there, because then we kind of would be saying that we support what happened in the past and that everything is fine and dandy. We don't need to deal with our issues. Our issues are no longer outstanding because they're being dealt with. So I don't believe we really want to get engaged. And I was saying earlier, I think we want to continue working on a government-to-government basis, dealing directly with the federal government, not through some nonprofit organization. But one of the things that I vehemently oppose is Parliament passing legislation that's going to be entrenching in legislation falseness in terms of who represents whom. And as I say, the federal government isn't keeping up with its reconciliation initiatives. One of its big initiatives was reconstituting Métis nations, Indigenous nations. And we at the Manitoba Métis Federation, which is now declared last weekend the national government of the Red River Métis, and the Red River Métis meaning the citizens of the historic Métis Nation, wherever they live in Canada or outside of Canada, is the legitimate government of the Métis Nation. The Métis National Council is a membership organization made up of 4 governing members. The courts in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario just over the last 2 to 3 years have said they're not governments. They're nothing more than voluntary membership organizations, and Métis can belong to them if they wish or don't wish. But there is an initiative under the so-called these 35 reconciliation tables, which Minister Bennett brought in, and which she refused for the national body, where we could have kept, some national principles which would have guided these instead of creating these, these silos of self-government bodies by province, carving up our nation. It's like municipalities in Quebec, becoming, recognized governments and carving up, the Quebecois nation. And so we're totally opposed to that. And so as the MNC is staying in there as representing the Métis nation, I would call it an illegitimate act.
Thank you very much, Madame Gill. We'll now go to Ms. Idlaut for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. It's been a long time since I last saw you. I think we saw each other in New York the last time when the United Nations met to address issues of the Indigenous peoples. I think that was the first time we met. When I became a member of the parliament, the members of the NDP appointed me to monitor or to work with Mark Miller and other Indigenous, to work with the committee, to become a member of this committee in terms of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. So I monitor the ministers, the work that has been done by ministers, and I always have a huge task, and I'm learning along the way. And now I am just learning about the issues that Métis nations face. Now it states here in Bill C-29, under 10.1c, it states that there will be a member of the Métis National Council. I understand that you identify this as just a body and not as part of the government. Now, now, when there is a member of the Métis Nation, aren't you concerned that in terms of the reconciliation process, aren't you concerned that Métis Nation will not be represented in the reconciliation process?
Nakovic, thank you for that. There's a lot of things at play here. One is the commission itself, and one is who represents the legitimate interests of a people, in this case, the Métis Nation. And as I said earlier, as long as the MNC is referred to as what it is, a not-for-profit organization with a membership base, well, they can represent whoever they want, wherever they want. We can't stop that. But if it comes to the point, and I think there's still some potential where, through the Section 35 rights reconciliation table, that each of these 3 provincial bodies get recognized as Section 35, having Section 35 rights by province. Well, we totally oppose that, because then it's just carving up our nation, destroying our nation, doing what English Canada couldn't do in 1870 and 1885. Then you have English Canada today, trying the same thing through the back door by, using Parliament to divide us. And we won't stand for that. But in fact, we've already, as I say, the national government of the Red River Métis, we already have thousands of registered citizens throughout the prairies and outside of the prairies, people that have moved. And so we will continue on this path. And the federal government, approved by cabinet, has already signed, and you have the self-government agreement, the only one of its kind. So on the one hand, they can't say we recognize you and your government, and we recognize that you represent your people wherever they may live, and then turn around and say, but we're going to recognize this, nonprofit membership, pan-Aboriginal organization that the MNC has become, and thwart, our future. So there's going to have to be some balancing. That's why I say the federal government is not keeping up with the progress of reconciliation that has happened since 2015.
Thank you. Now, I think there's something that needs to be added to this proposed bill. I think this bill should include studies of Indigenous rights, whether it supports our Indigenous rights, when our rights are violated, what is in place to amend this bill. If this bill was to be amended, this C-29, what would you recommend that Bill C-29 include?
Well, you see, it depends on what the purpose of that bill is. I mean, and I'm not clear yet what the purpose is. In my mind, I see the purpose as being implementation of the calls to action, at least as the primary focus. But I know there's some, what people say, weasel words. I mean, there's some very broad words elsewhere that say it's to deal with everything. But what is that everything? What does that mean? So if it's going to deal with more than just the calls for action, perhaps it should address issues such that you have raised. For the Métis Nation, there's so many issues that would need to be raised. Aside from the residential schools issue, there's still the whole dispossession of our lands and resources through this Dominion Lands Act and this script system that came about. In other words, allocation of lands on an individual basis to destroy our nation. That was done in such a shabby way, and it benefited white speculators. In fact, in the Blais case in 2003, the Supreme Court of Canada, without being asked, referred to it as a sorry, like script speculation and devaluation is a sorry chapter in Canada's history. Even they know it. Everybody knows that we got screwed. But yet we're excluded from land claims processes, specific claims processes, all the processes set up by the federal government. We're not engaged. We decided to take an action in Northwest Saskatchewan in 2019, but the federal government is ganging up on us with the Métis Nation of Alberta, Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, saying as individuals that were aggrieved, we have no right to be in court. It's only these provincial bodies that can be in court on Section 35 rights. So your government, not your government, but the federal government is fighting us on a lot of issues and where they should be opening the door. And I had actually written to both former Prime Ministers, Paul Martin and Harper, to try to set up some kind of royal commission to deal with the land rights issues of the Métis, and or give us money to take it to court, to let the courts decide. But nothing's happening on that. So when it comes to the Métis, really, we're kind of not even afterthoughts. We're just, kind of brought along. And we've benefited, don't take me wrong. The legislation that I referred to, the health legislation, the languages legislation, there was some other one, child and family services. We were part of that. We were part of the co-development of it. And that's coming from, I think, the work that was taking place by the TRC. And we benefited from it. We didn't say, no, we're not going to benefit. But it wasn't aimed for us. But we had to be brought along because they're one of the three, Aboriginal peoples contained in Canada's Constitution. So we have benefited to some degree. But again, our big issues are not addressed. And we're saying we don't want this nonprofit body organization to usurp the role of our legitimate governments in resolving our issues, which are critical to us.
Thank you very much. We're a little bit tight for another round. The advantage, of course, for you, Ambassador, is that you've had the floor to yourself and have not had to share it. So I think we've asked a lot of questions. So thank you for coming today I'm assuming you came from Manitoba, but we're very glad that you were able to join us and to give your views on this very important subject. So thank you, Ambassador Chartier. And with that, colleagues, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.